Hello, beautiful, wonderful beings of this planet and other planets. Don't want to exclude people from other planets. It's me again, Zolelwa, and this is DrZolelwaReads, and welcome to episode number 4. Yeah. I'm having such a great time, like recording these episodes for all of you. I hope everybody's having a great time listening. So yeah, today I will be reading a book called Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor E. Frankl, a classic tribute to hope from the Holocaust. And about this book, I mean, I don't have like a super deep story. I think I just came across the book, and I can't say when. I don't like remember why and how, but yeah, it must have been some YouTube video where they were talking about hope. And of course, they went to this guy's book because he's talking about hope. And he is a survivor of the Holocaust. And I guess we all know what the Holocaust is. For those who don't, you could go do some reading. But, or you could watch stuff, or you can, there's a lot that's been said about it. So I won't like cover what happened and when it happened and all of that stuff, but if it's a story about hope during the Holocaust, it's like, yeah, that's like big stuff, you know. And so it's really interesting how the books that I've chosen are kind of, you know, there's like there's like a continuity. There we go. Hey, continuousness. Hey, continuity, you know. So there was a mention on somebody in the last book that I read whose parents survived the Holocaust, and the mom was unwell because, you know, she had this guilt of having survived. So yeah, what I'll do is read the back of the book as I've been doing, and then the chapters in this book are long, so I had to actually choose like the chapter at the end because that one is a bit shorter, which feels like maybe a bit of a spoiler, but I don't think it is. Like, you still won't know what happened in the beginning of the book. So this is the book. I don't think I showed you guys. This is the book. So yeah, I'm just, they, at the end, I mean, usually in other books it says like about the book, but these are other people talking about the book, but it's okay. If you read but one book this year, Dr. Frankl's book should be that one, The Los Angeles Times. One of the most outstanding classics to emerge from the Holocaust, Man's Search for Meaning, is Viktor Frankl's story of his struggle for survival in Auschwitz and other Nazi concentration camps. Today, this remarkable tribute to hope offers us an avenue to find greater meaning and purpose in our lives. Viktor Frankl is one of the moral heroes of the 20th century. His insights into human freedom, dignity, and the search for meaning are deeply humanizing and have the power to transform lives. Chief Rabbi Dr. Jonathan Sacks, that's who wrote that one. Next one says, Viktor Frankl declares that evil and, I don't know this word, ennui. I really probably should go and look up this word. I will. Cannot finally extinguish us. A hymn to the phoenix rising in each of us who chose life before flight. Brian Keenan, the author of An Evil Cradling. And then the last one says, an enduring work of survival literature. And so I can't say like I know people or know people whose people survived the Holocaust. Like, this is purely like I've just like read about it, you know, and read about some people's experiences. But for me, I would say there are a lot of situations in life where like you are suffering, you know, and they could be for various reasons. And so for me, as much as this book is about the setting that it's about, I think that some of these messages of hope can also be extrapolated and used, you know, because life isn't always like just like fun times and good times, you know. It it's not. So I think a book on hope is a good turn, you know, like it's like we're talking about all that happened to them, which is quite sad and tragic, but we're also talking about hope. And I think hope can be applied to so many situations. So yeah. The chapter that I'll be reading is called The Case for Tragic Optimism. Okay. Hey. Also, my lips were dry in the last video. And the sideshow. Eh? And the sideshow, guys, but my lips are dry. Yo. Anyway, we are learning. You know, you gotta have a source of hydration and you have to have something to moisturize the lips. So I will not put you through that again. Anyway, let us first ask ourselves, what should be understood by a tragic optimism? In brief, it means that one is and remains optimistic in spite of the tragic triad, as it is called in logotherapy. A triad which consists of those aspects of human experience which may be circumscribed by 1, pain, 2, guilt, and 3, death. This chapter, in fact, raises the question, how is it possible to say yes to life in spite of all of that? How, to pose the question differently, can life retain its potential meaning in spite of its tragic aspects? After all, saying yes to life in spite of everything, to use the phrase in which the title of a German book of mine is couched, presupposes that life is potentially meaningful under any conditions, even those which are most miserable. And this, in turn, presupposes the human capacity to creatively turn life's negative aspects into something positive or constructive. In other words, what matters is to make the best of any given situation. The best, however, is that which in Latin is called optimum. Hence the reason I speak of a tragic optimism. That is, an optimism in the face of tragedy and in view of the human potential which at its best always allows for 1, turning suffering into human achievement and accomplishment, 2, deriving from guilt the opportunity to change oneself for the better, and 3, deriving from life's transitoriness an incentive to take responsible action. It must be kept in mind, however, that optimism is not anything to be commanded or ordered. One cannot even force oneself to be optimistic indiscriminately, against all odds, against all hope. And what is true for hope is also true for the other 2 components of the triad. inasmuch as faith and love cannot be commanded or ordered either. To the European, it is a characteristic of the American culture that, again and again, one is commanded and ordered to be happy. But happiness cannot be pursued. It must ensue. One must have a reason to be happy. Once the reason is found, however, one becomes happy automatically. As we see, a human being is not one in pursuit of happiness, but rather in search of a reason to become happy. Last but not least, through actualizing the potential meaning inherent and dormant in a given situation. This need for a reason is similar in another specifically human phenomenon, laughter. If you want anyone to laugh, you will have to provide him with a reason, e.g., you have to tell him a joke. In no way is it possible to evoke real laughter by urging him or having him urge himself to laugh. Doing so would be the same as urging people posed in front of a camera to say cheese, only to find that in the finished photographs their faces are frozen in artificial smiles. In logotherapy, such a behavior pattern is called hyperintention. It plays an important role in the causation of sexual neurosis, be it frigidity or impotence. The more a patient, instead of forgetting himself through giving himself, directly strives for orgasm, i.e. sexual pleasure, the more the pursuit of sexual pleasure becomes self-defeating. Indeed, what is called the pleasure principle is rather a fun spoiler. Once an individual's search for meaning is successful, it not only renders him happy, but it also gives him the capability to cope with suffering. And what happens if one's groping for meaning has been in vain? This may well result in a fatal condition. Let us recall, for instance, what sometimes happened in extreme situations such as a prisoner of war camps and concentration camps. In the first, as I was told by American soldiers, a behavior pattern crystallized to which they referred as give-up-itis. In the concentration camps, this behavior was paralleled by those who one morning at 5 refused to get up and go work and instead stayed in the hut on the straw, wet with urine and feces. Nothing, neither warnings nor threats, could induce them to change their minds, and then something typical occurred. They took out a cigarette from deep down in a pocket where they had hidden it and started smoking. At that moment, we knew that for the next 48 hours or so, we would watch them dying. Meaning orientation had subsided, and consequently, the seeking of immediate pleasure had taken over. Earlier in the book, it speaks of like how, some of the times, like for work that they did, they would get, I don't know if it's a reward or like what, but they'd be paid basically in cigarettes, right? So basically these cigarettes could either be smoked by yourself, but this guy was busy saying that you would usually use cigarettes to trade, to trade a cigarette to get something else. And so when they saw someone decide to smoke their cigarette, it was like a sign that they had given up, So I just wanted to like add that. Is this not reminiscent of another parallel, a parallel that confronts us day by day? I think of those youngsters who on a worldwide scale refers to themselves as the no future generation. To be sure, it is not just a cigarette to which they resort. It is drugs. In fact, the drug scene is one aspect of a more general mass phenomenon, namely the feeling of meaninglessness resulting from a frustration of our existential needs, which in turn has become a universal phenomenon in our industrial societies. Today, it is not only logotherapists who claim that the feeling of meaninglessness plays an ever-increasing role in the etiology of neuroses. As Irvin D. Yellom of Stanford University states in Existential Psychotherapy, of 40 consecutive patients applying for therapy at a psychiatric outpatient clinic, 12, 30%, had some major problem involving meaning, as adjudged from self-ratings, therapists, or independent judges. Thousands of miles east of Palo Alto, the situation differs only by 1%. The most recent pertinent statistics indicate that in Vienna, 29% of the population complain that meaning is missing from their lives. As to the causation of the feeling of meaninglessness, one must say, albeit in an oversimplifying vein, that people have enough to live by, but nothing to live for. They have the means, but no meaning. To be sure, some do not even have the means. In particular, I think of the mass of people who are today unemployed. 50 years ago, I published a study devoted to a specific type of depression I had diagnosed in cases of young patients suffering from what I called unemployment neurosis. And I could show that this neurosis really originated in a twofold erroneous identification. Being jobless was equated with being useless, and being useless was equated with having a meaningless life. Consequently, whenever I succeeded in persuading the patients to volunteer in youth organizations, adult education, public libraries, and the like, in other words, as soon as they could fill their abundant free time with some sort of unpaid but meaningful activity, their depression disappeared, although their economic situation had not changed and their hunger was the same. The truth is that man does not live by welfare alone. Along with unemployment neurosis, which is triggered by an individual's socioeconomic situation, there are other types of depression which are traceable back to psychodynamic or biochemical conditions, whichever the case may be. Accordingly, psychotherapy and pharmacotherapy are indicated respectively. Insofar as the feeling of meaninglessness is concerned, however, we should not overlook and forget that per se, it is not a matter of pathology, rather than being a sign and symptom of a neurosis. It is, I would say, the proof of one's humanness. But although it is not caused by anything pathological, it may well cause a pathological reaction. In other words, it is potentially pathogenic. Just consider the mass neurotic syndrome so pervasive in the young generation. There is ample empirical evidence that the three facets of this syndrome, depression, aggression, addiction, are due to what is called in logotherapy the existential vacuum, a feeling of emptiness and meaninglessness. It goes without saying that not each and every case of depression is to be traced back to a feeling of meaninglessness, nor does suicide, in which depression sometimes eventuates, always result from an existential vacuum. But even if each and every case of suicide has not been undertaken out of a feeling of meaninglessness, it may well be that an individual's impulse to take his life would have been overcome had he been aware of some meaning and purpose worth living for. If, thus, a strong meaning orientation plays a decisive role in the prevention of suicide, what about an intervention in cases in which there is suicide risk? As a young doctor, I spent 4 years in Austria's largest state hospital, where I was in charge of the pavilion in which severely depressed patients were accommodated, most of them having been admitted after a suicide attempt. I once calculated that I must have explored 12,000 patients during those 4 years. What accumulated was quite a store of experience from which I still draw whenever I am confronted with someone who is prone to suicide. I explained to such a person that patients have repeatedly told me how happy they were that the suicide attempt had not been successful. Weeks, months, years later, they told me it turned out that there was a solution to their problem. an answer to their question, a meaning to their life. Even if things only take such a good turn in 1 of 1,000 cases, my explanation continues. Who can guarantee that in your case it will not happen 1 day sooner or later? But in the first place, you have to live to see the day in which it happens. So you have to survive in order to see that day dawn. From now on, the responsibility for survival does not leave you. Regarding the second facet of the mass neurotic syndrome, aggression, let me cite an experiment once conducted by Carolyn Wolfe Sheriff. She had succeeded in artificially building up mutual aggressions between groups of Boy Scouts and observed that the aggressions only subsided when the youngsters dedicated themselves to a collective purpose. That is, the joint task of dragging out of the mud a carriage in which food had to be brought to their camp. Immediately, they were not only challenged, but also united by a meaning they had to fulfill. As for the third issue, addiction, I am reminded of the findings presented by Annemarie von Forstmeyer, who noted that, as evidenced by tests and statistics, 90% of the alcoholics she studied had suffered from an abysmal feeling of meaninglessness. Of the drug addicts studied by Stanley Krippner, 100% believed that things seemed meaningless. Now, let us turn to the question of meaning itself. To begin with, I would like to clarify that, in the first place, the logotherapist is concerned with the potential meaning inherent and dormant in all the single situations one has to face throughout his or her life. Therefore, I will not be elaborating here on the meaning of one's life as a whole, although I do not deny that such a long-range meaning does exist. To invoke an analogy, consider a movie. It consists of thousands upon thousands of individual pictures, and each of them makes sense and carries a meaning. Yet, the meaning of the whole film cannot be seen before its last sequence is shown. However, we cannot understand the whole film without having first understood each of its components, each of the individual pictures. Isn't it the same with life? Doesn't the final meaning of life too reveal itself, if at all, only at its end, on the verge of death? And doesn't this final meaning too depend on whether or not the potential meaning of each single situation has been actualized to the best of the respective individual's knowledge and belief? The fact remains that meaning and its perception, as seen from a logotherapeutic angle, is completely drawn to earth rather than afloat in the air or resident in an ivory tower. Sweepingly, I would locate the cognition of meaning, of personal meaning of a concrete situation, midway between an aha experience along the lines of Carl Buller's concept and a Gestalt perception, say, along the lines of Max Wertheimer's theory. The perception of meaning differs from the classical concept of Gestalt perception, insofar as the latter implies the sudden awareness of a figure on a ground, whereas the perception of meaning, as I see it, more specifically boils down to becoming aware of a possibility against the background of reality, or, to express it in plain words, to become aware of what can be done about a given situation. And how does a human being go about finding meaning? As Charlotte Buller has stated, all we can do is study the lives of people who seem to have found their answers to the questions of what ultimately human life is about, as against those who have not. In addition to such biographical approach, However, we may as well embark on a biological approach. Logotherapy conceives of conscious as a prompter, which, if need be, indicates the direction in which we have to move in a given life situation. In order to carry out such a task, conscience must apply a measuring stick to the situation one is confronted with, and this situation has to be evaluated in the light of a set of criteria, in the light of a hierarchy of values. These values, however, cannot be espoused and adopted by us in a conscious level. They are something we are. They have crystallized in the course of the evolution of our species. They are founded on our biological past and are rooted in our biological depth. Konrad Lorenz might have had something similar in mind when he developed the concept of a biological a priori, and when both of us recently discussed my own view on the biological foundation of the valuing process, he enthusiastically expressed his accord. In any case, if a pre-reflective axiological self-understanding exists, we may assume that it is ultimately anchored in our biological heritage. As logotherapy teaches, there are three main avenues on which one arrives at a meaning in life. The first is by creating a work or doing a deed. The second is by experiencing something or encountering someone. In other words, meaning can be found not only in work, but also in love. Edith Weisskopf-Johnson observed in this context that the logotherapeutic notion that experiencing can be as valuable as achieving is therapeutic because it compensates for our one-sided emphasis on the external world of achievement at the expense of the internal world of experience. Most important, however, is the third avenue to meaning of life. Even the helpless victim in a hopeless situation, facing a fate he cannot change, may rise above himself, may grow beyond himself, and in doing so, change himself. He may turn a personal tragedy into triumph. Again, it was Edith Weisskopf-Johnson who, as mentioned on page 118, once expressed the hope that logotherapy may help counteract certain unhealthy trends in the present-day culture of the United States, where the incurable sufferer is given very little opportunity to be proud of his suffering and to consider it ennobling rather than degrading, so that he is not only unhappy, but is also ashamed of being unhappy. For a quarter century, I ran the neurological department of a general hospital and bore witness to my patients' capacity to turn their predicaments into human achievements. In addition to such practical experience, empirical evidence is also available, which supports the possibility that one may find meaning in suffering. Researchers at the Yale University School of Medicine have been impressed by the number of prisoners of war of the Vietnam War who explicitly claimed that although their captivity was extraordinarily stressful, filled with torture, disease, malnutrition, and solitary confinement, they nevertheless benefited from the captivity experience, seeing it as a growth experience.